Okay, welcome everybody to the 17th annual Charles Sidlow Memorial Scholar Residence Lecture. We will start with our own Dr. Rob Sidlow to talk about his father. Rob, I believe I've asked to unmute you.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. So thank you for joining, thank you to everybody for joining my brother Richard and me and our families this evening to learn Torah b'zchut our father, Charles Sidlow, Yisrael Clonibus ben Naphtali, Zichrono Livracha. We marked his 41st yahrzeit yesterday on 9 Shvat, and this is the 17th consecutive year we've been able to sponsor learning at Fleetwood Synagogue in his memory. We're grateful to Dr. Dasniel Rynhold, who has agreed to be with us tonight. A note of thanks is also due to Rabbi Rosenfeld and to our shul president, Joshua Schickman, for helping to coordinate this evening. Our father was born in 1938 in Berlin, Germany, 10 months before Kristallnacht. In 1939, just prior to the outbreak of World War II, his family was somehow able to secure precious exit visas to Chile, where they joined an expatriate community of German Jewish refugees in Santiago. He grew up in South America, became a chemist, emigrated to the United States, married, and finally settled in Los Angeles, where my brother and I were born. In 1980, he died unexpectedly at age 42. Rich had just had his bar mitzvah, and I was 10 years old at the time. In trying to reconstruct a thumbnail sketch of our father through the hazy gauze of time, a few features remain quite clear. He was a brilliant autodidact and was a Renaissance man. He had an insatiable mind and was constantly reading, studying, and exploring multiple avenues of thought, from science to politics, from art to history. Our Uncle Dan, who was the dean of a prominent medical school and is not an intellectual lightweight himself, says that his brother Charles was one of the smartest men he ever knew. One of the last recollections I have of my father was him spending a long Sunday afternoon alone at his desk, thoroughly immersed in multiple dog-eared textbooks as he taught himself to read and write Russian in the original Cyrillic script. Seemingly, this was a normal way to spend a free Sunday afternoon. Our father also had an incredible love for and memory of music. He could always name that tune in 3 notes or less. Despite our constant encouragement, he never chose to compete in that game show, which was filmed a mere few miles away from our house in Los Angeles. He would certainly have been a champion player. Another important recollection my brother and I have of our father was his strong connection to Judaism and its collective history. Rich and I are grateful to have absorbed a deep sense of loyalty to Jewish tradition from our father during the very brief time he was with us. It is our feeling that our father's memory is best honored through meaningful discourse on themes related to Jews, Judaism, and Israel. We are certain that our father would have enjoyed such an evening as tonight, and in this spirit, I'll ask Joshua to welcome Dr. Rynhold.
Thank you, Rob. I'm pleased to introduce our speaker tonight. Dr. Dasniel Rynhold is the Dean and Professor of Jewish Philosophy at the Revel Graduate School of Yeshiva University. Prior to joining Revel, he lectured in King's College London, the University College of London. He received his BA from Cambridge University, St. John's College in Philosophy, his master's degree in Hebrew and Jewish Studies at the University College of London, and his PhD at the London School of Economics in Philosophy. He is the author of several books, including 2 models of Jewish philosophy, justifying one's practices. Unfortunately, the format of this evening does not allow for signing. As well as an introduction to medieval Jewish philosophy, Nietzsche, Soloveitchik, and contemporary Jewish philosophy, and he edited or co-edited Radical Responsibility, Essays in Ethics and Religion in honor of Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. Without further ado, I introduce Professor Dr. Dasniel Rynhold.
Thank you, Joshua. Actually, it's not such a bad thing about the book signing. The rare copies of my books are always the unsigned copies. So I've been lucky enough to get to know Rob a little over the past 18 months or so. We actually met in unusual circumstances. that is to say inside and not wearing masks. Today, 23rd January 2020 CE, and Robert and I, of course, first met BC before Corona. So it is therefore sincerely my honor to be delivering the Charles Sidlow Memorial Lecture this Motzei Shabbat, knowing one of his sons, who I should add, it's been my great pleasure to get to know. And it was, really lovely to learn something just now about your father, Rob, and Rich, who I've just met. In thinking about a topic for tonight, I realized that the vast majority of people, if not everyone, who's either a member of a shul or simply attending a talk like this, will have read, or at the very least read, the Torah. And if at some point you've listened to, or again, maybe just heard, sermons or shiurim, you've also doubtless encountered a lot of Talmud. And looking at the illustrious list of those who have previously given this memorial lecture, also a lot of Jewish history. And that made me realize once again, indeed not for the first time, that what I do is a little strange. To explain. As an undergraduate, I studied, as was mentioned, philosophy. And in the UK, we don't have these liberal arts degrees. We choose a subject and we do a degree in that single subject solid for 3 years. So I studied philosophy and nothing else for 3 years at St. John's College, as was mentioned. And Cambridge has a tiny Jewish community. There was one Orthodox shul mainly populated by the students and run by the students. But a rabbi used to come up from London once a week to give those who were interested a Talmud shiur. And I'll always remember one week him telling me that a young lady who was applying to university at that time had spoken to him and told him that she was interested in applying to read philosophy at university, but she wasn't sure it was something she should be doing as an Orthodox Jew, right? She'd heard it could be controversial or problematic. And I'll always remember, in what remains to this day, I think the greatest backhanded compliment I've ever received, him telling me that he had responded to this young lady, well, I know this guy I see once a week. He's doing a philosophy degree and he seems all right. And this actually reflects something very true about the nature of Jewish philosophy. And can I share? Yes, I can share my screen with you. So hopefully you can all see that. Yes, the set of sources. So what that reflects is this kind of marginal nature of Jewish philosophy, because as the first quote there says, and this is from one of the classic surveys of Jewish philosophy, Julius Gutmann, he wrote that the Jewish people did not begin to philosophize because of an irresistible urge to do so. They received philosophy from outside. And the history of Jewish philosophy is the history of the successive absorptions of foreign ideas, which were then transformed and analyzed according to specific Jewish points of view. So the point that he's making there, right, starts off, the Jewish people did not begin to philosophize because of an irresistible urge to do so. Few people, other than sad people like me, I think, have irresistible urges to do philosophy. But the point that he's making is that if we did a random survey of Jews, I think kind of Jews of, any denomination, religious, secular, and asked who had read or studied in any way, piecemeal even, the Torah, the Mishnah, the Talmud, I think many, many people would say yes. And if you asked how many had read or studied Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, or Gersonides' Milchamot Hashem, Wars of the Lord, or even Rabbi Soloveitchik's Uvikashtem Misham, we'd find far fewer positive responses. And that's because, let's be honest, a genuinely good Jew can get to the end of their life having never opened a book of serious Jewish philosophy. It's a slightly marginal endeavor, truth be told. Our classic texts, right, the Torah, the Talmud, those are the texts that were the basis of Judaism at the point where Jewish philosophy really, began its life in the Middle Ages. And they're not really works of philosophy, right? If you open them and read them, they don't strike you as the genre that we call philosophy. Reading philosophy is very obvious when you're reading a book of philosophy. Usually some do with, eyelids drooping and snoring pretty quickly. But the fact is that you wouldn't mistake our classical text for works of philosophy. It is, as that rabbi's answer to that young lady many years ago indicates, a slightly marginal endeavor, to be frank. So I thought I'd take the opportunity tonight to talk a little bit about what Jewish philosophy is, why I think it matters, and to do so in the way I've just started, which is basically by weaving it into a sort of anecdotal, potted autobiography, because that is the one subject in which I can genuinely claim to be the world expert. So to begin with, what is Jewish philosophy? I have no idea, and I've been doing it for nigh on 30 years. When asked what plain philosophy is, it's very difficult to give an informative answer. Right? Among my favorites are that a philosopher is someone who has a problem for every solution, or that philosophy is the ungainly attempt to tackle questions that come naturally to children using methods that come naturally to lawyers. And the truth is, it is very difficult to give a better, a pithy, but genuinely informative definition of what philosophy is, let alone Jewish philosophy. So it's usually best to just do some. And as we go through the next, 40 minutes or so, hopefully we will. That will introduce us, if not allow us to define what it is we're doing. But let me begin by telling you that I never wanted to do this for a living. Right? I was never going to be a philosopher. I was going to be a scientist. And the truth is, I went to a school where, a Jewish school in England, in London. And, I'm a professor, so it's, won't come as a surprise. I did okay at school, in everything but Jewish studies, right? Because in Jewish studies, I was a terrible student. And the reason I was a terrible student was because I was being taught all these things. It was quite a, how might I put it, a Haredi-ish school, but the students weren't. And I was being taught things, and I was thinking, that can't be right. And this wasn't to do with religious doubts, by the way, right? It was not about kind of religion. This was just theological things I'm being told, thinking, no, that can't be right. And I just couldn't take it seriously. And like I say, this didn't translate into any kind of actual religious rebellion in any way. It was just thinking, I'm fine keeping Shabbat and doing that stuff, but what they're telling me doesn't make any sense. So I had no interest. And I had applied to go to university to study natural sciences, and I was going to study chemistry. And then I went to Israel for a year, to Yeshiva called Yeshivat HaKibbutz Hadati on Kibbutz Ein Surim, and for the first time was exposed to Jewish philosophy. We had a wonderful teacher, his name was Avram Stein, and he taught us a work of philosophy from medieval philosophy by Yehuda Halevi called the Kuzari. And the Kuzari is quite a traditional theology. It gives a very traditional picture of a God who speaks to human beings, who talks to the Jews and tells them that he wants them to do these things and not these things. Very traditional theology, but fascinating in the way it's presented. My teacher at the time, however, was not a big fan. And therefore, while teaching us this highly traditional version of philosophy, he also taught us, on the other hand, Maimonides, who, theologically speaking, was utterly opposed to Yehuda Halevi. Right? Maimonides' God is a far more austere God, a far less traditional version of God. Maimonides' God doesn't speak, for example. And therefore, for all that, he's an absolutely traditional Jewish practitioner and rabbi and legal thinker, halachist. His philosophy has, since time immemorial, been very, very controversial. And as I sat there in that class, listening to, on the one hand, this one theology of Yehuda Halevi, and on the other hand, this other philosophy come theology of Maimonides, I was genuinely blown away. because there I was feeling vindicated, right? What I'd been told at school, actually, Maimonides, of all people, somebody that the rabbis teaching me would quote very often, completely disagreed with most of the theological truths that they had taught me. And it really did open a world to me suddenly where I thought, wow, you have these two figures, Yehuda Halevi on the one hand, Maimonides on the other, and they can barely agree on a single matter of theological significance, right? Existence of God is obviously they're in agreement. Observance of mitzvot, they were in agreement. Most other things, they absolutely disagreed on. And this really opened a new world to me. I went at the end of one class to Avram Stein, and I remember saying to him that this is fascinating, but I said, Yehuda Halevi is a bit too mystical for me. And Maimonides is a bit too rationalistic for me. Is there anything in between, right? Now, I think what I was maybe thinking of when I came across these thinkers and wasn't really quite with it with either of them. I was fascinated, and like I say, it really, caught my imagination, but I didn't actually find myself thinking, yeah, I will go with that view or that view. And it's possible the reason for that is the second quote here. This is Rav Soloveitchik, the great 20th century modern Orthodox rabbi and philosopher, who wrote in a book called The Halachic Mind. He writes, medieval Jewish thought, despite its accomplishment and merit, has not taken deep root in Jewish historical religious realism and has not shaped Jewish religious world perspective. We know that the most central concepts of medieval Jewish philosophy are rooted in ancient Greek and medieval Arabic thought and are not of Jewish origin at all. It is impossible to reconstruct a unique Jewish world perspective out of alien material. And what Rav Soloveitchik's referring to here goes back to the first quote, because Jewish philosophy really began when the Jewish worldview, and whether there is any such thing as the Jewish worldview is something we'll return to, but say the 8th, 9th century, 10th century even, the Jewish worldview would have been formed by the Tanakh and the Talmud, and therefore you would come away with a picture of a very traditional notion of God, a God who knows what's going on in the world, knows that you're sitting here tonight, who commands you to observe mitzvot, who created the world, etc., etc. And in the 10th century, suddenly, Jews were exposed to an alternative, right? There had always been alternative religions, but on the whole, they were more pagan religions. The attraction wasn't their great intellectual capacity. So suddenly in the 10th century, due to translation of a whole raft of works of Greek wisdom into Arabic, and the Jews at that time living under Islamic rule were speaking and reading Arabic, Jews were suddenly exposed to an alternative. And suddenly they had an Aristotelian view according to which God doesn't speak, and God doesn't know what you're doing, and God didn't create the world. And all of a sudden, therefore, there's another worldview, right? We go back to Gutmann, right? They receive philosophy from outside, and the history of Jewish philosophy, history of successive absorptions of foreign ideas, right? We have our worldview, suddenly there's another one, and they're not saying the same thing. And Jews confronted with that, living in a world where everybody pretty much agreed that revelation is a source of truth, right? Unlike in the modern era where that's not necessarily something that is a majority view. But certainly back then, everyone would accept revelation is a source of truth, but also reason is a source of truth. What do you do then when they clash and they say different things? That's medieval Jewish philosophy. That was the birth of the project of medieval Jewish philosophy. How do you deal with that conflict? But the problem, therefore, as Rav Soloveitchik points out, is, all right, so then what do you do? Right? If Maimonides is just kind of grafting Aristotle onto Judaism, it's just Aristotelian philosophy? What makes it Jewish? And that actually leads to the following dilemma. And the dilemma is, and this is where we'll start doing something that is in itself a philosophical question. The following dilemma from Zev. He writes, how can a certain concept be truly philosophical and simultaneously Jewish in its essence? When one posits certain values which are found in Jewish sources, then one of two conclusions must be valid. If the value has philosophical meaning, its Jewish origin is merely of historical interest. If it contains meaning that is uniquely Jewish, it ceases to be philosophical as the term is generally defined. What is Levy saying here? Let's take as an example science, right? Swap in science for philosophy. Right? How can something be truly scientific and simultaneously Jewish in its essence, right? If you posit something found in Jewish sources, right, then either it's good science, yeah, and then fine. If it happens to start off in a Jewish source, that's nice for us, right? We found it first, but it doesn't make it Jewish science, does it? Right? Einstein was Jewish. The theory of general relativity is not Jewish science. Because if it's science, it's just science. And like I say, it's nice, right? If we can claim, yeah, it was one of ours that got it, but it doesn't make it Jewish. But at the same time, if it is particularly Jewish, well, then it's not science, right? If Einstein's giving us some kind of, Jewish thing, well, that's not science. So Jewish science can't be Jewish science. And what this dilemma is saying is, well, how can there be Jewish philosophy? If something is philosophically true, it's philosophically true. If it's Jewishly true, that's very nice, but it's not philosophy. Because surely philosophy is there to gain objective truths that are simply truths, the way scientific truths are simply truths. So these first three quotes, all, if I'm being extremely generous to myself, admittedly, right, would ex post facto explain why maybe I wasn't that comfortable with, say, Maimonides, trying to graft Aristotle onto, but isn't that just Aristotle? Like, what makes that Jewish? Halevi, like I say, too mystical for my tastes. And I don't think at the time, when I was, 18, 19 years old, that's what was going through my head, right? But clearly they didn't speak to me, and I went to Avram Stein and I told him so. But that yields retrospectively now this question, which is, okay, so what is Jewish philosophy? If it's a clash between two worldviews, Judaism says this, Aristotle says this, they clash, let's see who's right. But whoever's right is just going to be right for everybody, not just for Jews. Either God does do that kind of thing or God doesn't do that kind of thing, period. So it becomes very difficult to understand what would be, as Levy puts it, Jewish philosophy. As an aside, there are those who therefore do think there's no such thing as Jewish philosophy. Dan Frank, who is a very significant scholar of Jewish thought, writes that Jewish philosophy is an academic discipline invented in the 19th century by scholars intent on gaining a foothold of academic respectability. He believes Jewish philosophy was invented basically in Germany when Jews are trying to introduce Jewish studies to university curriculum, and in order to do so, had to present something that would make the cut for people who weren't necessarily that interested in Judaism, and therefore they put in the Maimonides and they put in the Gersonides because these people were good rationalists, but they kicked out all the mystics because they thought that wouldn't play well to a university audience. So Jewish philosophy became a thing we invented where we put in the thinkers that might be attractive to German society in the 19th century and nobody else. I don't agree with that, but the fact is, historically, certainly, right, there's something to it as the beginning of university studies in Jewish philosophy, and he says it precisely because he does agree. There is no such thing as Jewish philosophy. So, what do you do? Well, what I did, to return to our story, is I asked Avram Stein, well, like I say, is there something in between? And he told me, read something by Rabbi Soloveitchik. I go next door into the Beit Midrash, and I found Lonely Man of Faith. That was the work of Rav Soloveitchik that they had there. And I sat there and I worked my way through Lonely Man of Faith. And I was absolutely blown away by it, right? Genuinely. It was unlike Halevi or Maimonides, this Aristotelian stuff. It was modern. It really spoke to me and spoke my language, albeit my vocabulary at the time did not contain words like ontological and epistemological. But I read it with a dictionary by my side, slowly. But I really did find that it absolutely blew me away. And sounds too good to be true, but this is absolutely true. At that moment, I sat there in that Beit Midrash and I thought to myself, why am I doing chemistry at university? Right? And the reason was because I'd been good at it at school. So you just go on and do what you were good at school and do. I'd never stopped and got off the treadmill to think, hang on, what do I actually want to do with my life? And at that moment, I thought, that's what I want to do. Right? That's what I want to do. So I got back, started at university, and thought, don't be rash. After 2 weeks, I changed to a philosophy degree, right? And not a day goes by that my parents don't regret it. No, they're very proud. They can say, my son, the doctor. I believe they're here tonight, actually, somewhere hiding amongst them. But that's absolutely true, right? That is absolutely no word of a lie. I sat there and I thought, that's what I want to do. And I really did. I gave it 2 weeks. Incidentally, of those 2 weeks, about half of it was Sukkot. So I hadn't even been to any of the lectures yet because it was all Yom Tov. Anyway, so I ended up doing Jewish philosophy. But the question is, right, what was it about Rav Soloveitchik? What was it about Jewish philosophy of that ilk that attracted me, that suddenly really, caught my eye in a way that the medievals hadn't? So I want to talk a little bit about what it was that Rav Soloveitchik wrote or said, just very broadly, without kind of into the details of his thought necessarily, but what it was that attracted me, and in so doing, maybe talk a little bit about why there can be Jewish philosophy, right? To answer the dilemma, answer the problem that I set up. And the first thing to note about Soloveitchik, of course, is that his books, the ones that are famous, Lonely Man of Faith, Halachic Man, all of that, right? He's not doing the same thing that the medievals were doing, right? The medievals, let's take Maimonides, for example, we're taking a set of topics, ultimately a set of conclusions, like, for example, God created the world, and they were suddenly confronted with an opposing conclusion, which is, no, the world is eternal, Aristotle says. They've got a clash and they've got to sort it out. Divine attributes, talking about God. The Torah does so. Aristotelian thought of this era, which isn't really Aristotle, but that's another story. Aristotelian in some way thought says, no, you can't talk about God in that way. What do you do? God knows what's going on in the world and knows individuals. Aristotelian thought says, no, he doesn't. What do? You have here two sets of conclusions clashing with each other. Now, in the modern era, and people often pin this on Immanuel Kant, the great 18th century philosopher, people started to doubt our ability to really know stuff about God, indeed even prove God's existence. The idea that you could prove God's existence came under fire. Kant undid a lot of the classical arguments for the existence of God. And in that shadow, modern philosophers, including Rav Soloveitchik, working and thinking, yeah, you know what, maybe he's right. Now, not that that matters, right? Very few people, I would, hazard to guess, maybe it's presumptuous, but very few people, let's say, who are here tonight who believe in God do so because they were convinced by the ontological argument. right? Whether or not you can prove it isn't actually that important to most people who believe it. And for Rav Soloveitchik too. So what does he write about? Well, as he tells us in that very book that I learned, Lowly Man of Faith, he writes at the beginning of it, theory is not my concern at the moment. I want instead to focus attention on a human life situation in which the man of faith as an individual concrete being with his cares and hopes, concerns and needs, joys and sad moments is entangled. Rav Soloveitchik's interest wasn't on these theoretical questions, these grand questions, creation versus eternity, the nature of divine attributes, the nature of God's knowledge. That's not his question, right? His question is about the man of faith as a concrete being and his life, right? The lowly man of faith was not about trying to work out some kind of abstract theoretical notion. It was, as he tells us at the beginning of it, devoted to trying to understand the relevance of the life of faith in a modern world, written in the 1960s, highly positivist science, right? Science is everything. And in a world in which science is everything, and everything therefore is about some kind of utilitarian end, right? Some useful product. What relevance is the life of faith? That was his question, right? He was interested as a person of faith already in the meaning of that, articulating it, because he had basically understood and accepted the following. One of my favorite thinkers, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was for a long time not a favorite thinker amongst Jews, but turned out that was due to a mistaken interpretation of Nietzsche that has been rubbished by a Jewish writer, Walter Kaufmann, in the 1950s, who showed that Nietzsche was not who people thought he was. And he writes the following here: an affectation on departing, it is called. Nietzsche says he who wants to desert a party or a religion believes it is incumbent upon him to refute it. But this is a very arrogant notion. All that is needed is that he should be clear as to the nature of the bonds that formerly tied him to this party or religion. There's the fact that they no longer do so. That he should understand what kind of outlook impelled him to them, and that it now impels him elsewhere. We did not attach ourselves to this party or religion on strictly rational grounds. We ought not to affect to have done so when we leave it. Now, what is he saying there? Admittedly, he's talking about leaving religion. Right? Nietzsche was brought up, he came from a long line of Lutheran pastors, and was going to himself, he started off studying theology to become a pastor himself, but then he lost his faith famously, and therefore he's kind of telling us about that journey. And what he's telling us is, I don't need an argument for why I've left. I haven't left because of some proof. Nietzsche didn't believe there was any proof against the existence of God, any more than there's proof for the existence of God. But what he's telling us here that's of relevance to us isn't to do with leaving religion, it's to do with entering it, because as he says, we never attach ourselves to it on strictly rational grounds. Let's go back to what I mentioned just before about arguments for the existence of God, right? With me personally, being brought up in a modern Orthodox home, the reason that I continue to, be devoted to that lifestyle is not because my parents sat me down at the age of 5 and said, Dolly Face, because that's what they called me, God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. This is Anselm's ontological argument, and that, Dolly Face, is why we keep Shabbos, right? That is not the reason, right? That's not how I got into this. And I hazard that that's not how many people got into it, right? We don't enter religion because of proof. And Rav Soloveitchik, in understanding this, decides that what matters is to do a very different form of Jewish philosophy. He's not interested in proving Judaism to anybody because he's already there. What he's interested in is articulating and understanding the nature of the faith to which he's committed and that he believes in. very difficult to prove the truth of a faith or another, right? That's why we call it faith. We have faith in a religion. And when we have faith in a religion, what's important and interesting to the Rav is, well, what can I say? How do I articulate the concepts, the beliefs, the ideas that are most central to my life of faith? And that's what he does. That's why it's halachic man, lowly man of faith, describing from within the nature of it and why it's compelling in a way that is hopefully interesting to lots of people, but won't necessarily be compelling to people who are reading it from the outside, right? Very few people who aren't Jewish are going to read the lowly man of faith and think, yep, you know what, he's right, I'm going to convert. Any more than when I've studied Aquinas, I think, yeah, you know what, that's right, I'm going to convert. Not that they're not interesting, not that they don't tell us things of value, but for us Soloveitchik, it's not about proof. It's about articulating and understanding the central ideas behind our way of life. The lowly man of faith, right? Who is the lowly man of faith? From a Jewish perspective, what is, or indeed more broadly, he often does speak about faith in general and its nature, right? The details, the meat on the bones there will differ depending on the religion, but he does think there's a nature of faith, obviously. Otherwise, why would he be writing and telling us about this particular notion of faith? But what's so interesting is, therefore, he's doing something completely different. And again, going back to the 19-year-old in the Beit Midrash with the dictionary, reading Lonely Man of Faith, right? What spoke to me, rather than grand abstract designs of Maimonides versus Halevi, which I still love, still fascinated by, still work on and write about. But ultimately, the thing that really got me, as someone who, as I mentioned, was already, this was the life I lived anyway. It was just nobody had ever given me a theology of it that I could buy into. And suddenly there's somebody writing on exactly that, right? The issues of the life of faith as a, Orthodox rabbi writing at the time to a young Orthodox Jew, reading that and really feeling, wow. One of the things about Rav Soloveitchik that was most interesting, I began with that nice pithy definition about a philosopher being somebody who has a problem for every solution. That's actually something that runs through Soloveitchik's work, that the life of faith is not for him supposed to necessarily be straightforward, easy. That faith isn't about answering all your questions. Often it's about deepening them or understanding them properly rather than solving them. And I think maybe back then that's something that appealed to me. It doesn't appeal to everybody, mind you. Many people don't like it for exactly that reason. They want answers. But back then, to me, that really spoke to me. But it doesn't to everybody. And the interesting thing is that Rav Soloveitchik himself knows that. Because what he also tells us, other than I'm not doing the old abstract theory thing, right? That's not what I'm doing. I'm speaking from within a faith, trying to understand it and articulate it in an intelligent way that will speak to those who are looking and trying to understand that. And that can be very, very important, not for everybody. If you don't have questions, you don't need answers. But for those of us, particularly in our day and age, right, where we're incredibly self-critical and very reflective, for many people that's important and that matters. And Rav Soloveitchik gave it to us, but gave it to us in the following way. Because he tells us, when I speak about the philosophy of prayer, or Shema, says he, I do not claim universal validity for my conclusions. Whether taking into consideration the differences between minds and the peculiarities of the individual, my experience can be detached from my idiosyncrasies and transferred to others, I do not know. Unlike the medievals, Maimonides believed that everything he said about Judaism was universally true. Right? Going back to Levy's dilemma, he would ultimately say, you know what, Judaism is true, and actually, if you are fully rational, you would be Jewish. Right? That ultimately is really what lies beneath Maimonides. And in the modern era, that's much more difficult, at least for me, to believe that anybody who isn't Jewish, it's because they're not following the argument properly, right? Oh, if only they were right-thinking individuals, they'd be Jewish too, really? Right? Or Rav Soloveitchik doesn't believe that either. And he tells us, look, I'm going to tell you about my philosophy of prayer. I'm not going to say it's universally valid. He's not even going to say it's universally Jewishly valid, right? He says, take into consideration my idiosyncrasies, who I am, how I think. Can my idea about prayer be just transferred to anyone and everyone else? Maybe not, I don't know. But this is how I make sense of it. This is meaningful to me. Maybe this will make sense of it to you. But without for 1 second claiming that it's universally true. Now, of course, he believes it's true. That's why he's telling us. But does he think if you don't agree with him, then clearly you don't have a Jewish view of prayer? No. Right? What Rav Soloveitchik here reflects is a idea about Jewish philosophy that's actually very, very important. And that idea is encapsulated by a Jewish thinker. I don't think necessarily call him a Jewish philosopher, but somebody who was Jewish and a thinker, Marx, who, as the story goes, was at a soiree once trying to impress a young lady and went into a whole speech, and at the end said, so those are my principles, and if you don't like them, I got others. With Groucho Marx, by the way, I should have said. So now I think there's something fundamentally true about that for Jewish philosophy, right? Which is that, as I started by saying, Yehuda Halevi, Maimonides disagreed on everything theologically, but both are different paths to the same practical outcome. They would have eaten at each other's houses, right? But up here, they were miles apart. By the time we get to modern philosophy and Rav Soloveitchik, he's already self-conscious about that, saying, I am articulating for you my understanding of Judaism. This is how I make sense of it. This is my theological scaffolding for my way of life. But you might share the same way of life and you might not be convinced by this, and okay, right? He would think you're wrong, yeah, but he wouldn't say, and therefore you're a heretic and it's illegitimate. No, there are different pathways, right? There's the Zohar and the mystics, and there's the rationalists and the Maimonideans, right? Don't agree on a single thing, but all doing the same. Like I say, different religious sensibilities call for different theologies to back up what it is they're doing. And modern Jewish philosophy recognizes that. And it just so happens that I read this work that clearly did that for me and inspired me to go on this, now 30+ year journey studying this stuff. So going back to Levi's dilemma, can you do Jewish philosophy? Truth is, the Maimonideans would have said, well, yeah, but actually Jewish philosophy is true for everybody, so everybody should believe this. In the modern era, they actually undermine that whole universalist assumption, right? Well, if it's true, it's the truth. No, there can be a way of life that contains certain ways of looking at things that are Jewish, but there can be alternate ways of life where people look at things very differently, right? As a Jew, one has faith in one's way of life as the best, whatever it might be. But Rav Soloveitchik explicitly writes, yeah, but Christians think that too, and they should do, right? Every religion for him has the right and should think it's the one truth. The idea that there's one measure that we can convert them all to see who's the winner is something that they no longer accept. For Maimonides, Judaism was the truth. Why? Because there's this one thing. It's called the truth. And for him, Christianity had that much, Islam that much, Judaism was the winner. For Rav Soloveitchik and for these types of modern thinkers, that's not the case. There isn't a neutral standard that you can translate every religion into and then measure it and, against this one measure and yeah, we the winners. There are these very different worlds based on completely different assumptions that cohere for the people within them. And Rav Soloveitchik has no interest in articulating somebody else's. What his interest is in articulating ours. And articulating ours can be a valid philosophical endeavor and an important one. But even so, and the irony is I moved here from, as you can hear from the accent, the deep New Jersey accent. So I moved here from London, and coming from there, here we go, ended up on the East Coast teaching Soloveitchik. I think I'm one of the only Soloveitchik scholars on the East Coast who cannot state or begin by saying I was a Talmud of the Rav. Wrong continent, wrong generation. But I was inspired by him, but inspired by him to maybe go in different directions, because ultimately he also recognized the following, and this is something that Aviezer Ravitsky wrote about Rav Soloveitchik himself, who apparently once said, I have devoted Talmidim, very devoted Talmidim. If I were to announce this shiur at 2 o'clock in the morning, they would come on block, and yet deep in their hearts, they think I'm an apikoros. To return to our starting point, even Rav Soloveitchik understood that Jewish philosophy, was still kept a little bit at arm's length, right? These are devoted Talmidim who would sit in every Talmud shiur he ever gave. But when it came to the philosophy, but that stuff's a bit, I don't really, don't really get that. I don't deal with that stuff, right? He knew that, he understood that. And therefore, as I say, it's not necessarily an endeavor for everyone. But as a way of articulating in a very self-reflective age, what it is, what the key ideas are behind our religion, and different opportunities, different ways of looking at that, right? Different ways of understanding that. That's kind of the way that Jewish philosophy has developed into the now 21st century. And really studying the tapestry, right, of all these different views is something that I find inspiring, important also in increasing tolerance for people with very different views than your own, who sit next to you in shul, right? So you can have very different views, very different theological scaffoldings. And that, I think, is very important. It also means, of course, that the little bit of the tapestry I gave to you, I hope you've enjoyed, but you don't have to agree with a single word of it. So with that, I will conclude, and just to say that it's been, my great honor to do this, and I hope that, in the zechut of this, that Charles Sidlow's neshama should have an aliyah. And I'm happy to take some questions if there are any as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rynhold. If anyone has any questions, they can use the reaction buttons on the bottom of their screen to raise their hand. I guess use the clap or the thumbs up so that Professor Rynhold can unmute you for your question. It looks like we have one from Dr. Sidlow.
Excellent. Let me, there we go. The ask on mute, actually.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can.
Excellent. Thank you so much. The one question that's bothering me after hearing your talk is, I may agree with you 1000% that the study of philosophy should make things easier for a Jew to deal with other Jews and also to deal with other religions, other cultures, etc. Do you find in your experience as someone who studies this and teaches this, that this is actually the effect that you're getting from what you're trying to do?
It's a very good question. And you know, the truth is that well, let me again tell you a story, actually. And this is genuinely, I think, as a teacher, my proudest moment. So a long time ago, when I was still teaching in England, I had somebody take Maimonides course with me, and he was a Chabad rabbi, right? A Chabad shaliach. So I've got this Lubavitch rabbi sitting in my classes, and we became very good friends. And when I moved to the US, I went in the first summer, I went back to London, and he called me up and said, "I'm here in London, let's go for coffee." So I went for coffee, and we were chatting, and he told me the following. He said he went to, one of the big Chabad, dinners for all the shlichim from around the world. And he was there, and somebody was talking about Maimonides to him. And the person said to him, if you don't learn Maimonides, derech Hasidus, right? If you don't learn him through the prism of Chabad Hasidut, you don't know what you're talking about. And this Chabad rabbi, my student, who was still a Chabad rabbi and on shlichut elsewhere, said to me, and I said to him, you know what, I studied Maimonides with somebody, and he didn't learn it through the prism of, Chassidut, but he knew what he was talking about. So, that was like I say, I like that because it opened his mind to something else, such that he would even tell his fellow Chabadnik, you know what, there are other ways that actually kind of make, without, however, upsetting his own. He was still an absolutely dyed-in-the-wool Chabad rabbi. Mm-hmm. So there are definitely occasions on which it does have that positive effect. I do get asked sometimes. I got asked by a student a couple of years ago, undergraduate, who said to me, how would you feel if you taught one of these controversial views and you heard that somebody as a result had lost their religion, whatever it might be? And I have to say, I said to him that I doubt very much that if that's the case, that was all down to something I said in a classroom, right? I think things are much more complicated than that in terms of the causal thing. So, I would never arrogate to myself that much influence or power, right? All I do know is that there are occasions when certainly, people have reacted in the way and told me so. And I guess that's a bit of a self-serving answer, because I'm saying when it's good for me, I'll say it, I did something good, and when they go off, it wasn't my fault. But I think there is some truth to that, right? Because the whole fact is, in the positive story, I changed nothing other than taught him something, and he was like, that's interesting, and it made some impact. So it's not, bigging myself up in terms of a life-changing event. It's just, it had the desired effect. And yeah, I'm just not sure. I just don't think that the causal chains are as direct as, well, somebody read a bit of Maimonides and that was it, singly in isolation from everything else going on. So I guess maybe that's just me consoling myself with that for self-protection. But I think I do actually, I do believe it. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Anybody else wish to?
If I may, I have one more question.
Absolutely.
What do you think are the philosophical questions right now, 2021, that are on the bleeding edge of Judaism?
Oh, goodness me. So the funny thing is, and again, this in part relates to some of the things we spoke about, I think that such questions existed when the medievals and even the early moderns had very specific challenges, right? I believe this, you believe that. How do we bring, what do we do about that disagreement? In a way, I do think nowadays it's a little bit more sort of, amorphous. It's precisely because it's more a general attitude, I suppose, right? Almost a kind of, anti-religious is maybe over-egging it, but certainly a much more skeptical view of religion, such that the kind of Rav Soloveitchik project of trying to show that being a religious person need not conflict with taking the best of everything in the world and not rejectionism, and trying to show that it can be relevant to a fully integrated person in the modern world. That general idea is probably actually the thing that bothers people the most in terms of trying to see whether you can speak about Judaism in a sensible, intelligent way to intelligent people who are critical thinkers, right? To be able to do that. And it's not always that important, right? But frankly, the complaint very often from many people, Rav Soloveitchik included, is, and you see this all the time, and this is what I experienced back in high school, right? Which is people teaching, and I don't know, if you're a lawyer, say, and somebody gives you a really shoddy legal argument, you'll rip it to shreds, right? But if someone, if a rabbi happens to tell you something that's theologically nonsensical, you just say, oh yeah, okay. Like people just don't, think critically in that way. So for those who do, then it's important for them to have, that kind of articulation, I suppose, of Judaism. Yeah, I see a question there. I'll unmute the cactus. Hi.
Hi, I just wanted to thank you for an amazing talk, and wanted to tell you that I too, that Rav Soloveitchik was a life-changing event for me too. The Rav of my shul, Maria, and when I was growing up about your age, teenager at the time, I sat between Mrs. Soloveitchik and Tova and Atara on Rosh Hashanah and Kippur when the Rav would daven, and
Wow.
it was a life-changing experience for me, being very close. Mrs. Soloveitchik was my role model in life, and I can tell you. So I'm Robbie's mother-in-law, and I can tell you I really thank you for this talk, because
Thank you.
it brings back very special memories and meaning for me.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. And also, yeah, that's incredible. I actually have them to be very thankful to Tova and Atara. When the book that Joshua Schickman held up at the beginning, I remember writing to them because to get permission to quote lengthy passages enough that I needed copyright permission, I wrote to them, and they didn't know I was a kid from London writing to them, and they were very gracious. They wrote me a wonderful letter saying, yes, you can do it, you don't have to pay any, just go ahead and use it. And I was very grateful. So that was a very gracious thing that I always remember. So thank you for that. Thank you. There's a question here in the chat box. To what extent do your students at YU agree with your perspective about rejecting the pursuit of provable absolute theological truths? So it depends on the student, is the honest answer to that, right? There are some who it's something that they feel anyway, or they've never really thought about. And when you think about the implications of the alternative, they suddenly think, yeah, you know what, that makes sense. I mean, a story I often tell, I've told before, and Rob might well have heard me tell it, is, I taught at King's College London in the theology and religious studies department for 7 years before I came here. And I was the, professor in Judaism, and the vast majority of my students weren't Jewish, and they were taking a degree in theology and religious studies, right? And they would study, you could do Islam, you could do Christianity, systematic theology, and I was the Judaism guy. And some of them would stick with me for 3 years and actually take every semester, so 6 courses, I guess, starting from very basic introductory stuff to, by the end, relatively advanced stuff, such that they'd had 3 years and studied Judaism to quite some degree. And yet in all that time, I never got a single convert. Not obviously, I say that tongue firmly in cheek, I wasn't trying to convert anybody, but what does that mean, right? It means A, either I'm a terrible teacher, possible. B, they're all just stupid, right? They couldn't follow the argument to realize Judaism's the trick, right? Or it kind of backs up the idea that you can't prove, right, in a neutral, from the ground up fashion, religion, right? They would have a very good understanding of Judaism by the end of those 3 years, I hope, or at least some, degree of understanding far greater than they had. But it was an understanding that was the understanding of an outsider looking from the outside. And now, I understand why you do that. But it wasn't like, gosh, yeah, I should do that. And unless we're going to say that they all were, just, not very bright, and I can tell you, with certainty that's not the case, right? They were very bright. It must be that understanding and devoting myself to religion is about more than and provable is the important term here, right? Because we're not saying that we don't believe that this is the truth. The question is, can you prove it on completely neutral grounds that will convince any rational people? That's the question, right? So it's not about undermining one's absolute commitment. I'm absolutely committed to it. And, if I'm presented with an alternate, say, Christian theology, makes no sense to me whatsoever, right? Really doesn't. I had wonderful colleagues at King's who I was the only Jew there. They were lovely people and good friends, and they were extremely intelligent, right? Professors way, higher up than me. But from my perspective, boy, they believe some really weird things that no sensible person ought to believe, right? Now they look at me. I hope they thought he's a nice guy and he's my friend. I hope they thought he's intelligent, but I know they thought, but he does some really weird things that no sensible person ought to do, right? Okay. So that's why I think that the idea of it being neutrally provable, I don't see that as problematic, right? The question of absolute commitment's a different thing, but I don't think it has to relate to truth. Now, do all students accept that? Why, right? Do most of those who take my classes? Probably, because the people who are going to take graduate level Jewish philosophy are a pretty self-selecting bunch, let's be honest, right? So, but for certain, there are those not. But hey, not to compare myself, put myself even in the same ballpark, but they did burn Maimonides' books, so they burn, little Daniel Rynhold. Anyone gonna care? Nobody, believe me. Professor Dean David Berger will not be teaching a course on the Rynholdian controversy at any point in his career. So it's it really it does depend. Obviously, people are going to see this differently depending on the very difference in religious sensibility that I was sort of speaking about. But I think, like I say, you'd be surprised. My Chabad rabbi friend being a good example. So, but it varies, no question. Anybody else? If not, who is it Joshua or Rob or
Thank you so much to Professor Rynhold. I guess Rynhold. I've been pronouncing it wrong for all these years. I apologize.
That's quite right.
Um,
Tomato, tomato.
right, but that one, tomato's correct. So thank you so much for your wonderful lecture tonight, and to the Sidlows for sponsoring another wonderful memorial program for their father. May his Hashem have an aliyah. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.